But I think the big question when I think about Mexico overall is they've got two stud strikers that are playing pretty well at the particular moment. I guess if you're a Milan fan, maybe you feel different about Santi Giménez, but you also
I like him.
Okay, I like him too, but has he been the answer? Has he been an improvement over Morata or Tammy Abraham? Maybe over Tammy Abraham, but Morata, that's a big conversation to have potentially. And then you have Raúl Jiménez, who's at Fulham, right? For me, if I was Javier Aguirre, I don't want to give El Tri any tips, but I think what makes them more dynamic is if you start both of those guys at the same time, Big Tones. If you just have one and they become like for like, I as a center back, as the resident center back, or call it what you want, I just think that becomes easier to handle, especially if you're going to roll out potentially, in my wishful thinking, best 11, if they played the U.S., you roll them into three center backs, right? And that just becomes harder for that particular Raúl or Santi to have success. You roll out two of those guys, which would be a bit of a throwback to have two strikers of their size and their caliber out on the field at the same time. I just, all of a sudden, I sit up a little bit like, okay, let me see this version of Mexico. But if they just go with one striker, I'm like, all right, you're now relying on wingers. They haven't been as dynamic. You got Huerta on one side, Alvarado on the other. Yeah, those guys are good, and they can do some things from time to time. But I don't know. Having both those guys on the field at the same time, I think makes Mexico a lot more dynamic and dangerous.
Well, I'll throw this into sort of the mix here with that conversation. Aguirre likes to play in a 4-2-3-1, right? We've seen it before. We saw it in November. He did play Raúl Jiménez in the 10 role against Honduras. Didn't work out. He played Orbelín Pineda up top. Didn't work out for him, but that's where he played him to start the game. Does maybe he go with that experiment? I'm with you. I'd look, if inherently you put those two guys on the field, you got Santi, who likes to run in behind, right? Run off the shoulders of defenders. And you got Raúl, who's more of a target player and a beast in the box. Like, he finds space in the box, and every cross you see, he's battling for everything. For me, you got two different players. The only thing is, do they step on each other a little bit in the box? But if I'm game planning for those two guys, I mean, you really got to concentrate on two guys that do a little bit different things but have the same mission, and it's to score goals. You occupy your two center backs, right? In our case, we're thinking with Pochettino, it's going to be that hybrid system where we have three in the back, and we try and defend with Robinson coming back, and that's going to be a really difficult component for people to deal with, those two guys. I don't know if he's going to do it. The one thing, Santi Giménez has not been good for the Mexican national team. He's one of those players that he's divided opinion for a long time. Henry Martin was the guy forever. So Aguirre, he's got his hands full with the number 9 position. I would guess if you got to pick one, Raúl if you're going to play with a point guy, Raúl is the guy right now because he's in really good form. That's what I would guess he would do, but who knows, right? We're not in that dressing room, and in the end, like you say, Jimmy, nor do I care what.
No, that's true. but just kind of stripping away our emotion towards the rivalry for a second.
Yeah.
I think when we hear from the best coaches, and let's even use a U.S. comparison. Let's say Bruce Arena. Bruce, I thought, did a really good job of like, how do I get my best players on the field playing in their best positions? And if they're smart enough and have high enough IQ, they're going to figure out how to coexist on the field. And I wonder if you gave that type of trust to Raúl and Santi, they could not. I mean, of course, you put them. You have ideas of where they should move in certain situations, but can they do it in real time? Right? It's one thing to say it on paper, and I need you to do this when the ball's in this area, and so on and so forth. But there's a certain fluidity that comes,
right,
and a rapport that exists, and they just seem like they could be a real threat if those two could figure it out. And ultimately, though, that puts more pressure on providing service for these two particular players. If you're going to go with two out-and-out strikers, and yes, they do have different player profiles. So I do, and I'm glad you brought that up. Raúl likes it; he can hold up the ball, and Santi likes to run in behind. That sounds like a great combination of two different strikers for me, and it gives you a little bit of a different dynamic of how you want to play and how you want to build out in your transition play. Or if a team sits in a low block, you have two guys up top that can get on the end of crosses. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. Again, I don't want to give them any tips, but
right. So
if you're going to do that, though, yeah, but you have to sacrifice somewhere else. And I wonder if Mexico could manage having two strikers that are occupying that area of the field and then being vulnerable somewhere else? Do they have the capacity to make that happen? And maybe that's where Aguirre has to figure out, how to figure it out.
So let me just throw it to you from a managerial standpoint, right? You mentioned earlier, and I completely agree. If you're Mauricio Pochettino, you want to put a trophy in the cabinet right now, right? If you're the other three teams, you're like, I don't want US winning this thing again. If you're Javier Aguirre, right, you got one mission, right, with this team, and that's to get them back. Mexico's mission is to get back to the top of CONCACAF, right? They were at the top of CONCACAF for years, and then they got knocked off. You look at Aguirre, and you're like, this guy needs to win something to get people rallied around the Mexican national team. Does he experiment with two forwards at this time, or does he go with something that's tried and trusted for him in his career? That's the question, right? Are you going to experiment right now in a moment where you need to do something to get the Mexican fans on your side? Or are you going to use this as an experiment? Do you do it for 45 minutes and say, hey, I'm going to give you guys 45 minutes to make this thing work? I don't know. I don't know the answer. Yeah. I'm just throwing it out there.
And is Canada the best opponent for you to try it, right? Now they have to look at the opponent in particular. So we'll talk about Canada in the next break. But let's take a look at the projected 11, or what we think Mexico is going to do in that formation that Tony mentioned in a 4-2-3-1. So you got Angulo and Huescas from FC Copenhagen on either side. On the back line, you got Vasquez and Montes. The center backs, Alvarez from West Ham and Romo, will be sitting as double sixes, but either one can join the attack at times. Pineda will be sitting in front of them as a 10. And then, as I mentioned before, the wingers most likely will be Huerta and Alvarado. And then we have Raúl starting up top instead of Santi. We'll have to wait and see if that changes. And Big Toe, so if let's say you went with Raúl and Santi, and we look at this projected 11, where would you sacrifice? Which player do you think comes off? And then we have Luis Chavez could also play in Romo's position as well. I like Luis Chavez's game a lot. Where would you sacrifice if you were a coach? You could even just leave the names out, but if you went with two strikers, which position would you drop? Would you just go with a straight 4-4-2 and maybe lose Romo?
I think Romo's been the one consistent, although he doesn't cover a lot of ground. He's a really good passer of the ball. He gets in good spots to break up plays, which is everything that they've wanted Edson Alvarez to do for years. I think they like those two together. Jimmy, I think if you think that your two outside backs can go and attack, Huescas is an interesting one, right? He's the guy from Copenhagen.
That's right.
Is that right? Yeah. He's the interesting one. I think you take Orbelín Pineda out and you go just with a straight 4-4-2 and let those two guys, Alvarez and Romo, kind of sit behind the back four or three, depending on if, when your wing backs are getting forward. I would think that makes the most sense, right? You couldn't have – I don't think you could have – well, you can tinker with the formation, but I don't know that you can have both the Santi and Raúl on the field with Pineda behind them and then think you can you can balance it behind them nearly as easy if you don't go with a 4-4-2. But there's been stranger formations, right, that we've seen.